Book Nibbles. Big Ideas, Small Bites. Adam Grant's Think Again. The power of knowing what you don't know is both an invitation and a challenge. At its heart, the book urges us to embrace intellectual humility, to cultivate the habit of questioning our own convictions, and to find strength not in clinging to what we know but in the courage to rethink, relearn, and update. Grant, an organizational psychologist and celebrated author, weaves together stories from science, politics, sports, business, and everyday life to illustrate the pitfalls of overconfidence and the rewards of curiosity. Instead of celebrating certainty, he makes a compelling case that the true mark of wisdom is the willingness to admit that you might be wrong, to recognize that knowledge is provisional, and to treat beliefs as hypotheses rather than immutable truths. The book is not about abandoning principles or living in indecision, but about approaching the world with the flexibility of a scientist, the humility of a learner, and the resilience of someone unafraid to change their mind. Grant begins by observing how most of us instinctively protect our beliefs as if they were personal property. We adopt roles like preachers, prosecutors, and politicians. In preacher mode, we defend our sacred beliefs, refusing to let them be questioned. In prosecutor mode, we attack others' arguments with zeal, hunting for flaws. In politician mode, we campaign for approval, tailoring our views to win favor. These modes feel natural, but Grant argues they keep us entrenched in rigid thinking. What we need instead is to think like scientists, people whose job is not to be right but to discover what is true. A scientist forms a hypothesis, runs tests, updates based on evidence, and revises when the data changes. To think again is to live in this mindset of constant experimentation. One vivid story Grant shares is about a firefighter named Wagner Dodge, who in 1949 led a team battling a forest fire in Montana. The fire suddenly exploded, trapping the crew. Dodge ordered his men to run uphill to safety, but realizing they couldn't outrun the flames, he did something radical. He lit a fire in the grass ahead of him and lay in the burned-out patch. The main fire swept over him, and he survived. Tragically, his team did not follow, clinging instead to their training and instincts. Dodge had rethought the situation in a moment of crisis, improvising a counterintuitive solution. His men, unable to abandon the belief that fire should be fought, not lit, perished. This story becomes a metaphor for the book's central theme. Survival, literal or intellectual, often depends on the ability to abandon old mental models and create new ones. Grant also uses examples from the business world. He describes how BlackBerry, once the dominant smartphone company, refused to rethink its strategy as Apple introduced the iPhone. BlackBerry's leaders clung to the belief that physical keyboards were indispensable, even as evidence mounted that consumers preferred touchscreens. Their refusal to think again led to decline. Contrast this with Netflix, which began as a DVD rental company but continually rethought its business model, first pivoting to streaming and later to producing original content. Netflix thrived precisely because it was willing to rethink. In both cases, we see how the difference between rigidity and flexibility determines success or failure. But why is it so hard to rethink? Grant dives into psychology to explain. Humans crave certainty. Beliefs give us a sense of identity and stability. Letting go of them feels like a threat to who we are. In addition, the more we argue for our positions, the more entrenched we become, a phenomenon known as belief perseverance. Confirmation bias nudges us to seek evidence that supports our views and ignore contradictory data. The Dunning-Kruger effect tricks the least competent people into being the most confident, because they lack the awareness to recognize their own ignorance. These biases make us not only resistant to rethinking but often blind to our own blind spots. Grant suggests cultivating confident humility, a balance between knowing what you know and admitting what you don't. This isn't about doubting yourself into paralysis, but about holding your beliefs loosely, like possessions you're willing to trade if something better comes along. He draws on research showing that experts who express more uncertainty in their predictions are often more accurate than those who express certainty. The willingness to hedge, to say "I'm 60% sure," reflects deeper thinking. In contrast, overconfidence can be disastrous, especially when leaders are involved. One example comes from the medical field. A study found that doctors who expressed high confidence in their diagnoses were not necessarily more accurate than those who acknowledged uncertainty. In fact, The more confident doctors were, the less likely they were to order further tests or consider alternative explanations, leading to mistakes. This illustrates the danger of arrogance in professions where lives are at stake. But it also carries lessons for all of us. Confidence without humility blinds us. Humility without confidence paralyzes us. Together, they empower us to keep moving forward while staying open to correction. Grant is careful to show that rethinking is not just about abandoning old ideas, it's also about building habits that encourage curiosity. He encourages people to seek out challenge networks, groups of people who will question and critique you, rather than echo chambers of agreement. Too often, we surround ourselves with cheerleaders who make us feel good but don't push us to grow. Real growth comes from those willing to disagree respectfully, to point out flaws in our reasoning, to say, "Have you considered another angle?" He cites research showing that students who are taught to debate in classrooms learn to think more deeply and retain information better. Disagreement, when constructive, sharpens thinking. Grant even explores how to change other people's minds. He notes that arguing like a prosecutor rarely works. People dig in deeper when attacked. Instead, persuasion often comes from asking questions, listening, and inviting reflection. Motivational interviewing, a technique used in therapy, is one such tool. Rather than telling someone they're wrong, you ask them why they believe what they do, what doubts they might have, what they'd need to see to change their mind. By guiding people to articulate their own reasons for change, you bypass defensiveness. Grant shares stories of climate scientists, political activists, and negotiators who used curiosity and listening, rather than forceful arguments, to shift perspectives. One striking story involves a vaccine skeptic. Instead of bombarding him with statistics, a doctor asked gentle questions. "What worries you? What information would help?" The skeptic admitted his fears were emotional, rooted in stories he'd heard. Through dialogue, he began to see the issue differently. This example demonstrates how thinking again is not just a solo act but a relational skill. Helping others rethink requires patience, empathy, and humility. Grant also turns the lens inward, examining how rethinking affects identity. We often fuse beliefs with self-image. If I define myself as a conservative or a liberal, questioning my political views feels like questioning my identity. Grant encourages a shift. Define yourself not by your conclusions, but by your values and principles. For instance, rather than "I am right," say, "I value truth, and I'm committed to updating my beliefs in light of new evidence." This makes rethinking less threatening. He uses the example of athletes who identify solely with their sport. When injury ends their careers, they struggle with identity crises. Those who saw themselves more broadly, as learners, leaders, or contributors, adapted better. Identity should be flexible, not rigid. He gives the story of Mike Lazaridis, the co-founder of BlackBerry, who once defined himself as an engineer obsessed with building devices. As the smartphone revolution unfolded, his inability to rethink his identity as more than a keyboard engineer limited his capacity to pivot. Compare that with scientists who proudly call themselves skeptics, embracing doubt as central to their identity. This mindset makes change natural rather than threatening. Education is another realm where Grant sees opportunities for rethinking. Traditional schooling rewards correct answers, not curiosity. Students learn to fear being wrong, to equate mistakes with failure. Yet, research shows that learning is deeper when students wrestle with errors and correct them. Grant advocates teaching children to enjoy rethinking, to see being wrong as an opportunity to grow. He cites teachers who reward students not for getting answers right, but for asking good questions, for changing their minds, for demonstrating flexible thinking. These practices build resilience and a love of learning. The book also explores the cultural dimension. Some societies prize certainty and discourage dissent. Others foster open debate and questioning. Grant points to organizations like Bridgewater Associates, an investment firm led by Ray Dalio, which institutionalizes radical transparency. At Bridgewater, employees are encouraged to challenge leaders, rate each other's arguments, and treat no opinion as beyond question. While not every environment can, or should, replicate this intensity, the principle is powerful. Cultures that normalize rethinking are more adaptive. Companies that refuse to rethink, like Kodak clinging to film in the digital era, often falter. Those that embrace it, like IBM transforming itself multiple times over decades, endure. Grant also explores the joy of being wrong. Most of us hate it. But he reframes it as a victory. Being wrong means you've learned something new. He shares his own story of discovering flaws in his assumptions about intelligence and teaching. At first, he felt embarrassed. But then he realized, each mistaken belief corrected was progress. He began to relish the moment of "I was wrong" as a chance to grow wiser. This reframing is liberating. Instead of fearing mistakes, you can celebrate them as milestones of growth. Sports provide another rich vein of examples. Grant tells the story of the Houston Rockets basketball team, which rethought traditional strategy by emphasizing three-point shots over mid-range jumpers. Initially mocked, the approach proved statistically sound and reshaped the NBA. This demonstrates how questioning conventions can lead to breakthroughs. Similarly, coaches who embraced data and analytics gained an edge over those clinging to gut instinct. The lesson is clear: industries, like individuals, thrive when they think again. The book's advice is deeply practical. Grant suggests making a habit of asking yourself, "What would change my mind?" This pre-commitment helps you avoid stubbornness later. He recommends seeking out diverse perspectives, deliberately exposing yourself to opinions that challenge your own. He urges readers to schedule regular rethinking time, moments to revisit assumptions. He suggests replacing certainty with probabilities, saying, "I'm 70% confident" instead of "I know." These small practices build a mindset of continuous learning. Grant closes with a hopeful message. Rethinking is not weakness. It is strength. It equips us to adapt in a fast-changing world. It fosters better relationships, as we learn to listen and empathize. It fuels innovation, as we question outdated practices. It nurtures wisdom, as we grow comfortable with uncertainty. Ultimately, it brings us closer to truth, even if truth is always provisional. Think Again is both a mirror and a map. It shows us our tendency to cling, to defend, to avoid doubt. But it also points us toward a better way, to live as scientists, explorers, and learners, not as preachers, prosecutors, or politicians. It asks us to treat our minds not as fortresses to be defended, but as gardens to be cultivated, where old plants are pruned and new seeds planted. The power of knowing what you don't know lies in the freedom to evolve, to become wiser tomorrow than you are today. And that, Grant suggests, is perhaps the most vital skill of all in the 21st century, not knowing everything, but knowing how to rethink. And that's it. Adam Grant's Think Again: The Power of Knowing What You Don't Know. Thanks for listening to Book Nibbles. If you enjoyed this bite-sized book, don't forget to subscribe for more quick, insightful summaries. See you in the next nibble.